Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. I'm Charley Walters. My guest today is Donick Cary, and there are a number of ways you might know Donick. He was a writer for the Late Night with David Letterman. He went on to be an executive producer and a writer as well on The Simpsons. He's worked on many television shows, among them Parks and Recreation, Just Shoot Me, New Girl. He also created the animated feature Little Bush, and he also directed the recent full-length feature documentary, Have a Good Trip. You also might know him. He might have been a classmate of yours at Nantucket High School back in the 1980s. But we're not going to talk about any of those things today. The reason why he's here is I had a conversation with our mutual friend, Nancy Walker, back in May. And she said to me, you know, Donick's working on another movie. I said, well, that's great. What's it about? And she couldn't tell me. But a month later, I ran into Donick at an event here on Nantucket. And of course, I said, what are you working on now? And he told me, and I immediately had two thoughts. Number one, this is a fabulous idea. And number two, it's not the kind of idea that I thought would have interested him. So Donick, welcome to the show. Thank you for doing this. And please tell us what the project is and how it came to be.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm excited not to talk about all that other stuff. Happy to talk about this. This is an interesting rabbit hole. You know, stories pop up when they pop up, and then they need to be told. They tell you if they need to be told. So this was one. I don't know if it needs to be told yet. We're working on trying to figure it out. We're still in process, but you know, I was born in Washington, D.C. I was a fan. My dad was a fan of the football. Many of you know my dad out there, Richard Cary, Actors Theater, among other things. But he's a Washington guy and was fans of the football team his whole life. And he passed that down to me. He and I shared a love of that team forever and ever and ever, watched all the games. And flash forward to Los Angeles now, and I have a Hall of Fame game room set up at my house where we watch all the games, and I'm passing that on to my son. So this is about 4 years ago. We have lots of memorabilia. We got a big neon sign that says the Washington Football Hall of Fame. And many of the kids I went to high school with know that this was my team. We had some Cowboy fans and Patriot fans, and we often would clash over Washington being the best franchise in the history of football. So anyway, we're watching a game. We've got all this stuff. And my son says, Dad, he's 8 years old. And he says, Dad, this is cool, but isn't it racist? And of course, he's referring to the name of the team and the Native American imagery. And, you know, there's always fans at the game in headdresses and beating drums and doing tomahawk chops or whatever. And I started to answer him in a way that the team has always answered, which was, they did a poll, 8 out of 10 Native Americans don't care. We're honoring them. This is, they should be proud that they have a team with their logo. The logo is not offensive. That looks like a real Native American. I started to say all these things. And then I kind of did a gut check, which was this thing where, like, when your kids ask you stuff, you take them seriously and you go like, well, what does this 8-year-old is asking about what is racism? Like, that's a big question. You know, when he asked me, where do babies come from? Or, you know, are the Rolling Stones better than the Beatles? We sat down and we really talk about that and figure out what does he need to know? And what do we need to, what is our culture? You know, like, what is our culture as a family? And what do I want to pass on to him? And we started to have a conversation about what is racism, you know, and we realized very quickly that we were having this conversation about Native America without knowing any Native Americans. First of all, I was like, well, that's weird. I don't think I know anybody who identifies as Native American. And also our history seems to have some gaps in it as we were talking about just the history in general. And he said something really interesting, which I in the course of making this documentary, we had decided we'd stop using the word, but he said, Dad, we should ask real R words. He said the name of the football team. And I went, oh, dude, you can't say, I don't think you can say that. So that when he said it that way, I realized, wow, that does sound racist to call another person by the color of their skin. Why am I hemming and hawing about this team name if when you say it that way, it's so clear? But also, that's a really good idea. My son's name is Otis. I said, Otis, we should go ask real Native Americans what they think and make a documentary about it. So 4 or 5 years ago, we started shooting interviews with people that we met. And it started to lead us down a lot of paths and take us in a lot of directions. Now, what has happened since then is we ended up talking to about 150 people. George Floyd happened in the middle of a pandemic. So a bunch of things started to happen in the world. And the whole country started to have a much deeper conversation about race than it had ever had before. And after George Floyd, and things, Uncle Ben's rice changed, and Aunt Jemima changed, and Eskimo pies changed. There was all these brands just started going like, we're not going to be in that business anymore. And it culminated.
And the Redskins changed. I mean,
and then
the Redskins got rid of their name.
And then they dropped their name. And we were in the middle of making this documentary going, I think they should change their name after all this stuff we've learned. And then they suddenly dropped their name. So our story, which I thought was a big part of this movie, actually kind of fell away, and it became more, we've been re-examining it and going like, well, what is the interesting stuff that we found that we want to share with people? And really what it's come back to is what we've learned about Native America kind of blew my mind. The places that I had blind spots and the places that I wasn't educated were really surprising at 50. I'm 53, 53 years old. I'm like, how did I not know there's 570 plus federally recognized tribes in America today that all have a different conception of what reality is? Basically, they have a different creation myth. They have a different deal with the US government. So some are rich, some are poor, some are in Alaska, some are in Cape Cod. They have different rights. They have a different country within our country. And I started to go like, wow, how are there almost 600 different countries in our country that are invisible to me? How does that happen? That's a really big question, and how does that then lead to it being okay that there's mascots and stuff, or us feeling like it's okay? Because if people are invisible and they don't exist, then yeah, sure, you can have team mascots. But if they're visible, it changes everything. So this became more of a movie about making people visible and talking to people.
Just to make it local for about 30 seconds, here I am living on Nantucket. You used to live on Nantucket. You still visit here. Almost all the place names on Nantucket are Wampanoag Indian names. And yet the average Nantucketer, myself included, knows very, very little about the Wampanoags.
Yeah. So I was thinking back about how growing up in general, the way I was taught was, people lived here, and there's some great myths about, how Nantucket is a moccasin and sand fell out of a shoe, or whatever those myths are, that are Native American. But that history really starts with the founding fathers. This is when things happened, the original families that came here and started whaling. And it's like, well, there was 10,000 years of history before that, but we really focus on, the beginning of the whaling days as we know them for white Europeans, and that blind spot seemed to replicate itself everywhere in the country. Wherever you go was like, right. And then there was a gold rush, and that's when people came and discovered this place or whatever. And it's not so much that it's like bad or anyone should be scolded for that. Our history is fascinating. The founding fathers of Nantucket are fascinating, but there's also an incredible amount of history that we don't know that happened before that. And in a lot of places in America, the people who were part of that history are still there. And I think we have this mythology that the myth of the American West is that Native America, we encountered them. They gave us the tools to live in America, the corn, and they were very kind and gave us some things. And then there was a war, and there was like smallpox and these sort of unfortunate things that happened, and then they disappeared, and left us this great country. And that's a fine myth, but it's a myth, and it is a great country. There's a lot of things that are great about it, but we've also kind of glossed over the fact that many of these people who suffered incredible trauma, generational trauma from whether it's genocide or erasure or, reservation systems, all this stuff, boarding schools, are still around going like, hey, what about us? You keep having these conversations, that seem to suggest that we died off 100 years ago and we didn't. That's a weird disconnect. Anyway, one of the things we're exploring.
Well, who are some of the people you've spoken with for the film?
So we started with, it was interesting. The very first thing we did was we were, and I went into this going like, is it really bad to have this? I mean, this football team is not hurting anyone, right? And one of the first places we went was weirdly Alaska. So we were up in Fairbanks, and we met, we were able to put together a panel of Athabascan tribes members. So they actually, all of them went to high school and played for the Whalers in their high school. I was like, hey, I played for the Whalers. Now they literally can still hunt whale there. That's one of the things they got from their treaties and agreements with the U.S. is they can still kill a certain number of whales, and they offered us whale meat, and that was fascinating. And but we sat down, and one of the guys we talked to was this guy, 400-pound guy, carries a gun, hunts whales. I would say more libertarian, but he was sort of like, look, I love the team in Washington. I could say whatever I want. This is America. You can do whatever you want. All good. The next day we sat down with him and 4 other Athabascans, and they were all like, dude, shut up. And then they shared their versions of it. One of them went to a college with a native mascot. They started to talk about how weird it was to go to the games of their college and have people dressed up like them, but ignore that they were sitting right there, and they don't dress up like that at all, or use their headdresses from an entirely different culture to represent what they were or whatever. So you started to get this other perspective, and in general these people shared like, oh, for us it's totally racist, we hate the name, we hate the team, it's has psychological effects against our children, are forced into these boxes of like a monolithic logo that all natives are the same. And they have enough trauma they're dealing with being in these sort of underrepresented parts of the country. So that was interesting to start in Alaska. Anyway, from there, we went all over the place. We went to the Gathering of the Nations in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is 500 plus tribes gather and have a powwow. They dance, they share ceremonial dancing and different ceremonies. We met a bunch of people there. We eventually got to Washington. We sat down with Deb Haaland, Congresswoman, who's now the Secretary of the Interior.
No, she's a Navajo, I believe.
She is from the Puebla Laguna tribe.
Okay.
So she's from the Navajo are there. What's really interesting for us too was as we started to travel is you'd go to like San Diego County to meet somebody from a one tribal identity, and they'd go like, oh, well, there's actually 17 different tribal identities in San Diego County alone. So, like the Navajo have a huge reservation and huge tribal lands in Arizona, New Mexico, Arizona, New Mexico, and
Utah, maybe?
Utah, yes. So they have a bunch of different states, but there are also like 15 other tribal identities all around them. So Deb is from that area, but not Navajo. Another interesting thing we learned, like all of these names are like the Navajo are actually the Dene. Their name for themselves is Dene, which is people. Most of these tribes are called the people or call themselves the people, and when settler culture arrived, they were like, hey, more people, let's have a conversation. And we saw them as like dangerous and other rather than more people to talk to. But the Navajo, for example, is a Spanish taking a word for horse thief that was what they would call that tribal identity, and then that stuck. And as the Spanish settled the area, they set up a Navajo reservation or help. Those names stuck more than their name for themselves. So there's a constant weirdness out there for people trying to figure out who they are.
So they're being referred to by a name that's not even part of their language.
Well, I guess Navajo is part of their language, but it's not the word they'd call themselves. It's the word for horse thief. So but it goes to this thing where like, okay, so if we have a football team called the R Word or the Chiefs or whatever, it's like this other layer of just branding humans as something else, like as something that they don't see themselves are. And it's very weird. It's very weird.
Well, now, when you were interviewing people in Alaska and New Mexico or wherever it happened to be, all these interviews, did you tape all these? Did you videotape all these interviews?
Yeah, so we thought the movie was going to be a father and son journey, heading out to talk to people. And we talked to 150 people and we taped all these interviews. Some of these we did ourselves with, like we kind of were starting with the idea that this would be like a father and son project almost, like instead of watching football games, we'll go out and make something. So we took our iPhones and we got these little attachments for the lenses and got nice lenses that go on them and an audio kit. And we just started shooting stuff ourselves. About halfway through, we were like, oh, let's start hiring real crews for these interviews. This is starting to get really interesting. But yeah, we shot a lot on our own, and we ended up with almost 1,000 hours of stories.
Wow. And of course, it'll be what, an hour and a half, 2 hours when you're done?
That is the challenge now. Yep. Is how do you take that? And so, yeah, so what I was going to say was like, what we thought the story was that it'd be this father and son journey where we really question, is this name offensive to other people? And then what do we do with that information? And we kind of made that story, and we're almost done making that story. A few things that happened with that before the team changed their name was we talked to a lot of people. Otis did his own poll. So the football team had done a poll in the 10 years ago that said self-identified Native Americans chimed in, and they had 8 or 9 out of 10 said it's not offensive. So the team would always use that. Otis did his own poll. He asked everybody we met. He got the entirely opposite results. Was like, well, 9 out of 10 people I meet, don't like the name, think it's offensive, think it's racist. Now there is a lot of when you're talking about 600 different countries in the country, within our country, and within each of those, rich and poor and educated and uneducated, and it's not monolithic. There were a lot of opinions. Some people hated it, some people loved it, some people don't care about football, some people love football. But in general, what we were coming away with was this idea that like, geez, 9 out of 10 people find this harmful and offensive and racist. What does that do? And now that we've made these friends, what do we do with that information? And we had a moment where we snuck into RFK Stadium, which was where the Washington football team had their glory days, and it's now a rusting hulk of a old football stadium. And we snuck in and we sat down. We talked about all the people we had met. We made a lot of friends. We kind of, that really changed our perspective on this and how it might affect people. And we decided, geez, we're not going to root for this team anymore until they change the name. Like it doesn't make sense for us. We would never have the friends we've made over to our Hall of Fame room now when we know how offensive this is to them. It was starting to be like if we collected Confederate flags and then we're like, let's have our Black friends over to our Confederate flag room. Do you think they'll care? It's like, oh, that's pretty lame. Anyway. Well,
now you mentioned the Washington football team, and that in fact is how they're being referred to at this point. In other words, they jettisoned the name Redskins, but they haven't decided on what they are going to call themselves. So they have this, it almost sounds like a parody. It's the Washington football team playing the Patriots or whatever.
Right. They've picked the generic. I always love that movie Repo Man, which was all about generic beer and generic food and stuff. And it's like, they pick generic football. That's what they do. But yeah, so we decided that we couldn't get the team to change their name at the time, but we could change the name of our game room. So we came back and we had a name change ceremony here at the house. We had about 40, 50 friends from Native America over. We played music. We took down all the stuff. This was a big move for me too. I mean, I really love watching that game, watching those games and that team. So this was big. And it was actually a pretty emotional day. A lot of the Native Americans who were there who hated the logo were actually pretty moved that Otis would take down his toys and stuff. And we had this thing, and then we had an interesting conversation about it. We had 2 things came out of it. One was what do you do with all this stuff? Like should we sell this stuff and like support, like education on a reservation or something? And the Native Americans who were there with us really were like, we don't want to sell. It's like selling Nazi memorabilia to support the Holocaust Museum. We don't want that money. That's like, the point is we want it gone. We don't want to be represented that way. So we put the stuff in boxes. We weren't sure what we were going to do with the stuff. I met an artist named Stephen Paul Judd, who I interviewed at Sundance a few years later, and realized like, oh, this is the guy who'll know what to do with the stuff. So we ended up sending 6 boxes of Washington football memorabilia, signed helmets and pieces of, goalposts and pictures and old Sports Illustrated. It's like all this stuff we sent to Stephen Paul Judd, who's Kiowa and Choctaw in Oklahoma. And he made an art piece out of it. Like he built this sculpture that's kind of a pile of all the stuff glued together in ways. And then when you turn a lamp on it, it projects a shadow, and the shadow says change. We recently got that piece. The Heard Museum in Arizona just acquired that piece. So we're going down in November to unveil Stephen's piece in Arizona, which is just a funny little side thing that we're doing. So that was one thing that came out of the name change. The other thing that came out of it is Otis and I did this presentation, and we thought, oh my God, and in general, I would say, I'm exhausted by cancel culture and woke culture. I think a lot of these things need to be examined, and there needs to be conversations had about stuff. I personally hate the divisive nature that most of these things take, which is like, you're either right or wrong. I think that we have to do a lot of conversation and education about all these things, whether it's, the name of a street of an old sea captain that might be offensive now. And like, let's have a real conversation about that. Let's not like jump to crazy sides, or changing Indigenous Peoples, Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Like there's a lot to that, and people are defensive. The first reaction is defensive and anger and pushback, rather than what are we really talking about? Let's have a conversation. So one of the things that came out of this name change was Otis and I used the name of the football team throughout it. We kept saying the R words, the R words, the R words. And a couple of Native Americans were like, we're so like happy that you've changed the name of your game room, but you're still using that word. And for me, and this isn't everybody, but for me, they would say, this is like the N word. So you're using this to my face in a ceremony where you're saying that you understand how offensive it is, and yet you're still throwing it around like it's not offensive. And that was like this weird gut check for us, where I thought like, wow, we're doing this great thing. This is amazing. We're able to change, and yet we hadn't really changed much at all, So that was it. That was interesting. And it sort of forced us that like where I thought the movie was ending was actually like a little rest stop in it. And it was like, oh, let's dig in a little more. And how do we have these blind spots? How do we all build these things that we, that are scary to confront and dig into? And then, how deep do they go? Where do they take us?
Let me go back to something you mentioned a few minutes ago. You were talking about those polls, and there were different polls saying, 90% objected, 90% didn't object to the old name. And I'm curious what you think about the polls that said 90% of them don't have a problem. I see it as a symptom of the racism. Were people afraid, in your view, to say, I do mind, or do they really not mind in those polls?
So many Native Americans have gone through with me through how those polls were conducted and who's being polled. Anyone we talked to was like, they didn't call me. I'm 100% Navajo or whatever. So it's not my opinion. Native America is, again, 700 different countries. So the fact that a poll could represent everyone is a ridiculous proposition already. The actual facts of the poll was they interviewed people who were self-identified Native Americans. So these aren't necessarily tribal members or registered tribal members or people within any more than like, there's sort of a trope that many people mention, which is everyone's said like, oh, we had a Cherokee grandma, my great grandmother was Cherokee. And for natives who are are, you know, growing up Native and identify as Native, that is this weird thing where it's like people get to put a badge that they're Native and somehow represent the issues of Native America. So it kept coming up of like that poll didn't represent Native America. It represented somewhere between 300 and 500 self-identified people who responded to a poll about a football team. In general, you know, that my opinion on polls is that they're very easily manipulated, including the poll Otis and I did was we talked to 150 people who wanted to talk about this and they all hated it. And I'm like, well, that was random, but all came up with the exact opposite result. So polls schmoles, you know, like I think the fact that as a fan of the team that I could often go like, well, they did a poll, they've done their work. I assumed that like arduous, you know, thoughtful work was done, that this must represent Native America. But I was taking that information from the football team, not from Native America. You can also look at hundreds of places in Native America. The National Congress of American Indian 50 years ago said, we hate mascots. These are harmful to our children. There's organization after organization has said that for year after year after year. And somehow it was easy for me as a fan of the team to ignore those, but take this random poll that the team, you know, had happily endorsed, you know? So that's tricky. It's tricky.
Now, with all the people you spoke with, did you come away with a feeling, and this will vary from nation to nation, I suppose, should we be saying Native American or Indian or neither or both? What should we be saying?
So this is another, we have a really good explanation of this from the curator at the Smithsonian Museum of North American Indian, who, you know, there's been different times in history where a new word comes up. He describes it as right now, Native American is the new thing that we've come up with. So white liberal America feels like that's what it's got to be. And otherwise we're offending people. He's Native American. He goes like, I've always been Indian because that's how I grew up as part of the American Indian movement, AIM movement in the 60s. So I'm Indian. He suggests that he would use them interchangeably. But ultimately, I think the answer is you have to listen to someone else how they want to be identified. You know, like I wouldn't say, you know, like Charlie, I don't know, this is probably a bad example, but Charlie, you're like a white guy, so I'll just call you a white guy. You'd be like, well, I'm more, I don't know what your background is, but you know, you probably have ways you want to be identified. That's not just a white guy.
Well, but even if I were to say, okay, that's fine, based on, I have Northern European ancestry, therefore I'm a white guy. Well, maybe not. I mean,
Right.
Not everybody in Northern Europe can be described as a white guy.
Right.
So
Right.
the more you dig into it, the less precise your answer can be.
And I think the real answer is that, and especially in Native America, because there's so many actual identities out there, is that my advice would be ask people how they want to be identified. You know, if they're Seminole, they might identify as Seminole. If they're Kiowa, they might be Kiowa. If they're Tongva, they're Tongva. If they're Wampanoag, they're Wampanoag. In general, your tribal identity would probably rule out above Native American or Indian or anything else. But the conversation I had with with this guy, Paul Schatt-Smith, he wrote a great book called 100 Things You Know About Native Americans is wrong, or maybe he said Indians. I'm not sure which he said, but it's a great book. Just fun, funny, interesting essays about all this stuff. But he points out over and over that like white people, you know, and we're in a conversation where a lot of these things are like, you know, some people use settlers still, and some people call us, you know, call white culture or pop culture, or dominant culture. But he was pointing out like white people and white liberals in particular want to figure out, come up with the fix, you know, like what is the answer? How do we fix this? Like, how do we make this right for everybody? How do we move forward? And the response I often got, because that's what we're making a doc. I'm like, should we not say the name? Should we say the name? Is the team okay? Is it not? I want answers, you know? And they're like, the fact that anybody wants to talk about anything about Native America is kind of groundbreaking right now. They're like, for our entire interaction with white settler culture, you've wanted to erase us and make us go away. So the fact that there's even anyone right now going like, are there some stories that might be interesting from Native America? Is there like, what? Let's start sharing those stories before we figure out how to fix American genocide. You know, it's like there's going to take some time here. Like, but the answer is, let's hear more stories. Let's start talking.
On the wall behind you, and it's been
Yeah.
behind your head for most of this, tell us about that photograph.
So
Or is it a photograph? I can't really tell.
yeah, this is here, I can give you a dynamic zoom in. Let's try some camera work. So this is a wall of, I know we weren't going to talk about other stuff. So one of the shows I work for, The Simpsons, I wrote an episode that was actually inspired by a trip I took to the Matticat Mall with my dad as a kid, where Homer and the kids go to the dump and go picking, right? They're looking for fun stuff to find. And Homer finds a box of detergent with Mr. Sparkle on it. So we did a fundraiser recently, a couple years ago, with Shepard Fairey at his gallery, where we had 60 artists reinterpret Mr. Sparkle. I, of course, bought 5 of the pieces from that thing. I didn't buy all 60, but I bought 5 of them, which are on the wall here. The one in the middle is by an artist named Greg Deal. He's Native American who lives in Colorado. And he did this piece where he had Mr. Sparkle in the hands of, I'm not sure. It says Pete on the picture, so I'm not sure. But he took a vintage photograph and reappropriated it and put Mr. Sparkle in. But Greg Deal is an interesting artist. He's done a lot of performance art. He did a piece he was from Washington, D.C., which is why I got to know him and talk to him. But he did a piece called The Last American Indian on Earth, where he dressed up in full regalia, but it was all made in China, you know, fake plastic feathers and whatever, and then walked around Washington and just talked to people about Native America, about Washington football, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the kind of comedy or performance art that makes me very nervous. I don't like confrontation. And there he was with fans of the team going like, yo, let me get a picture with you. You're great. You going to the game. And he's like, no, that is actually racist to me. And they're like, oh, cool. All right. So it's an interesting piece, but he did this piece and yeah, love it.
Well, no, as we're doing this show, the Washington football team is still going by that name. Do they have a timetable for getting a new name?
It sounds like next season they will unveil some new name. You know, they say they've done a lot of work. What really happened was, you know, this sort of, we had a funny moment in the movie where Otis and I, after we did the name change, we wrote a letter to Dan Snyder that shared with him everything we learned and said, please.
Tell us who Dan Snyder is.
Oh, sorry. Dan Snyder owns the Washington football team. He is an interesting guy in that he's a super fan. He grew up going to the games with his dad. His dad was a historian who wrote about Lewis and Clark and American white settler culture moving into Native America. So that's beside the point, but interesting. Dan made a whole bunch of money with in buying and selling, I believe, cable stations, and he bought the team. That was like his dream, to own this football team and recreate the glory days. And he's tried and tried, and it has gone poorly for 20 years. But actually, this week we're in the middle of well, this will air a little later, but this is the second day of, I would call it Washington football, WFT gate, where they did an internal review of the football team's culture. And one of the things that came out of that was 6,500 emails that got John Gruden fired from the Las Vegas Raiders because they were filled with misogynist and homophobic and, terms. But no one really knows what's in the investigation about the Washington football team. Dan's had to pay a fine to the NFL for $10 million for a toxic workplace. And there was a whole bunch of questionable behavior. I don't want to forgive it. There was awful behavior with the way they treated their cheerleaders, and it sounded like an awful situation. Anyway, that's all been kind of happening as we've been exploring this name. But we sent him a letter and said, Dan, please change the name. We want to root for the team. We love the team. And it happened to be the week that FedEx decided we can no longer get behind this team after what's happened with George Floyd and the conversation America's having. They pulled funding out, and basically because funding came out of the stadium and everything, Dan ended up dropping the name. So that happened. We like to think that we sent the letter and then they dropped the name, that we had a huge part of that. Now, I don't know if he ever read our letter, but there you go.
Well, a lot of these things are coming to a head right now. I mean, just this past summer, the Cleveland Indians announced that in 2022, they're going to be the Cleveland Guardians, which of course begs the question of, well, what about the Kansas City Chiefs? What about the Atlanta Braves? What about the Chicago Blackhawks, et cetera, et cetera? From your point of view, having worked on this project for years, what do you think is going to happen? Is this going to be or are these changes going to be across the board?
Yeah, look, it's a really hard conversation to have, because I think for sports fans, because none of us root for a team because we think it oppresses someone else or is we don't root for the Kansas City Chiefs because we think it denigrates Native Americans. We root for them because we love the team. We're from Kansas City. They're a great team. They have Patrick Mahomes, whatever. Those are, we're doing it out of good things because it's part of our family culture. So when someone says your family culture is racist, the tendency is being very defensive and to tell people to close your ears and not want to have the conversation. As we've been doing this documentary, I would say, we were right in the middle of the Cleveland Indians existed, the Washington R-words existed. The conversation I would have with Native Americans often would be, well, the name in Washington is the worst. And then I would get 100 reasons why it's an awful name. I can go through those now, but they dropped the name, so that's okay. There's still schools out there with the name, so it's still relevant to talk about. The the Cleveland Indians logo for everybody was that is like the Sambo logo. It is crazy that is a sports team logo that turns us into a caricature, and so there's a slur scale, they would go Indians isn't as bad as our words, but the logos may be worse, but that logo's here. Then there's the Chiefs. Now, the thing with the Chiefs, some people think Chiefs is bad because it's a monolithic idea. It lumps all Native Americans into one word and one idea of what Native America is. Other people don't mind the name, but hate that, when you look at a stadium, there's people doing war cries and dressing up with headdresses. For most cultures, headdresses are something earned. They're not even in most Native American cultures. So seeing white people dress up as their chiefs is like having a stadium full of rabbis if the team was called the New York Jews or whatever. You'd be like, well, that wouldn't happen. That's crazy. You wouldn't have a team called the Washington Blackskins and have Martin Luther King on the helmet and say we're honoring Black people. That sounds crazy. And yet for Native Americans, that's exactly what this is over and over and over, whether it's Chiefs or Braves or Blackhawks. Each one has a slightly different thing. The Seminoles say they've consulted with the tribes. The Blackhawks have consulted with people, the Native Americans who that specifically represents. Things like Braves and Chiefs are a little bit more this is all Native Americans, so it's both less direct of an insult, but also maybe a bigger one. It's complicated. And then you have Native Americans. Some love to wear the gear because they're at least we're represented in pop culture. Otherwise we're invisible. My takeaway after doing this for 4 or 5 years is we probably shouldn't be in the business of using other humans for mascots and logos. Just in general, it would be way simpler, if we stuck with bears and eagles and birds and snakes and whatever.
Well, it also leads to the question of, for example, and there are plenty of other examples, but cars.
Yeah.
On Nantucket, I'm one of who knows how many hundreds, if not thousands of owners of a Jeep Cherokee.
Yep.
Is that insulting? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a legitimate question in view of where we are as a culture right now.
Yeah, I think that like the most egregious things that are out there changed right recently. You know, that the Cleveland Indians were like, oh my God, in light, for whatever reason, after George Floyd, we all had this moment where we had to really, it shone a new light on stuff that had always been there. And certain things like the R word and that logo were like, we got to get rid of it. You know, Aunt Jemima has to go. We gotta move on from these. These are, but yes, it keeps going down, down, down. And I feel like there's a little bit of the next one up is like, well, Kansas City Chiefs is the next one's up for conversation. Let's have a conversation about it. I don't know if it should change or not change, but there's an exhibit at the Smithsonian, again, the NMAI, which is the National Museum of American Indian, called Americans. And it is 3,000 plus images from Native American logos, Jeep Cherokees, Apache helicopters, Land O'Lakes margarine, which also just changed. But you walk into this room and the question they're asking is interesting to me, because they're not saying, look at this, you racists. The question they're asking is, isn't it weird that we are pervasive? Native America is pervasive, and yet we're invisible as actual humans. That we're on every logo, on everybody's closet, in everybody's kitchen, in everybody's driveway, and yet we don't have any voice in anything. You know, that there aren't Marvel superheroes, that there aren't pop stars who are Native American. You know, that there's 6 million plus Native Americans with no actual voice, just logos. And I thought they did such a great job of going like, isn't this weird? And I guess it goes back to what I was saying before, is it's time to have that conversation. Is there a right or wrong answer? I don't know. Is the Seattle Seahawks, who have, you know, taken Native imagery and consulted with Native tribes to come up with their logo, better or worse than the R words? I don't know. Let's examine that. Let's talk about it. Let's you know, make informed, educated decisions. My guess is that Jeep Cherokee is probably, is really a conversation that needs to be had with the Cherokee tribal leadership and go like, how do you guys feel about this? Do you make money from it? No. Do you, are you honored by it? No. Like with the R words in Washington, that's $1 billion industry that doesn't really, Native Americans are kind of like, you're honoring us, but you're just making money off us is the reality. So, that there's a lot of nuance in there and conversation. And I think what the big thing that I was hitting on with this documentary was that it's okay to have blind spots. Like once I realized like, oh, this team is affecting people. I don't like the name anymore. Am I a racist? Am I a bad person? Am I, am I raising my son to be a horrible person? No, we didn't know how it affected people. We had never met anyone. We went and talked to people. Now we understand in a much more real way how that was affecting people. What do we do with that information? I think it's the same for everybody. Do your research on Jeep Cherokees. How does that affect it? Who cares? It doesn't care. There's lots of rabbit holes to go down on the internet of debate about that stuff. And then you really have to decide for yourself, like, what is your culture? How do you move forward? Do you write a letter? I'll give you an example. I had an interesting moment in Phoenix. I was doing an interview with a woman named Amanda Blackhorse, who had taken a lawsuit all the way to the Supreme Court about the Washington football team name being a slur, and why does the team get to use this and stuff. So it's an interesting person in the middle of this debate. I happened to be staying at I don't want to call out a brand if it's the wrong one. I think it was the Hilton at another word that we try not to use now after I went through this experience, but the female, a word that is often used to describe a female Native American, it rhymes with paw. I guess I'll use the name. I'm sorry it's so hard because I'm trying to do the right thing by people I've met, but this hotel was called the Hilton at Squaw Peak. And it was named after the mountain that it was at. And I had to tell Amanda, here's the address to come to this interview. We're at such and such Squaw Peak Lane at the Hilton at Squaw Peak. And she's like, that word is like is literally slang for female genitalia and a way to call a Native American woman. Like, it's the worst thing you could say. And I'm like, I know, what do we do? This is like on the billboard in front of the place. And I asked the hotel, like, is this, what's the deal? The Mountain actually had changed their name to honor a Native American service member, this woman, Laura Piesta. So it's called Piesta Peak now. And she was the first female service member to die in combat who happened to be Native American, and has a great story. And so they had changed the mountain, but the hotel hadn't changed their name. And I asked, like, why do you keep the name if culturally in the area you've decided not to use this? And you have a lot of Native Americans in the area who are incredibly insulted by this name that they take as a slur. And the hotel said, we have a lot of guests who are fine with it and we enjoy it. That come every year, and this is part of their culture. Sort of the same thing over and over. But then 6 months later, I noticed in the paper, like, Hilton at Squaw Peak changed his name to Hilton at whatever. And I was like, okay. So they figured, they kept having that conversation and then decided that it was better business ultimately to go ahead and change it.
Before we go, I want to ask some vital statistics, for lack of a better term, about the movie. First of all, do you have a title for it yet?
So the title is Hail to the Breadsticks. And that is complicated, but we want the title to make you go, what the hell is this? Not like,
That's what I'm wondering.
So one of the first times that somebody called out this blind spot I had was I was working at Parks and Recreation, and we were doing an episode set a year in the future. And the team from Parks and Recreation were going to Washington. And we had a line in the episode. We were pitching on this idea that they were going to go to the football game. So somebody said, hey, let's go to the blank game. And we thought it'd be funny to throw in a new name for the team and sort of suggest that Dan Snyder had to change the name. And we all pitched on it and came up with the idea that they would be called the Washington Breadsticks, and that the team had been forced to, the NFL had forced Dan Snyder to sell the team to the Olive Garden, where now they were the Washington Breadsticks. So the logo was these breadsticks, and you'd go to the game and you'd carbo load and you'd root for the team and eat your bread and whatever. So we made this funny thing. It ended up getting cut out of the show, but that Christmas, the staff gave me a Breadsticks logo helmet and a jersey as a Christmas gift. And I was like, ha, 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 all good. But that has become kind of the theme for us, was like, let's go into this kind of tricky subject matter where there's going to be a lot of defensiveness, where people are going to be angry and hold on to things, with some humor, with something we can kind of smile and laugh about, like Hail to the Breadsticks is ridiculous, but also is kind of about what we're doing, which is, let's have a few laughs while we do this. Maybe we can have a more nuanced conversation.
Now, what is your, again, for lack of a better term, what is your title? You're the producer, the director, both, more than that? Well,
Yeah.
How will your name appear on the screen?
Ultimately this is I guess like all I can think of is Spike Lee collapsed all those things into, it's a Spike Lee joint. This is a little bit of a Donick Cary joint, but I'm writing, producing, directing, but we're also, my son is a big part of this. He's contributed a lot of the ideas to this and trajectory of different ways we've gone. And then the other thing that we've really been exploring is we've been, I think we hit on a lot of these ideas, which is mascots and stuff exist because Native America is mostly invisible to pop culture and to us. So if we can make visible some of these people and meet some cool people that you wouldn't want to offend or you trust or think are cool, that will change the way you think about some of these issues. So part of the gist of the movie is, it's not so much just us making a movie, it's us starting a movie and then meeting people who make the movie, So a lot of this is Native American storytellers. We are doing this really interesting I think is interesting. Sorry. We're doing this thing where we're bringing some of our story to life with cartoons, where we're doing almost like a Simpsons episode, because the Simpsons there's a little theme of the Simpsons through this thing, where Otis and I are almost in our own Simpsons episode. And about halfway through, we realized, what if we turned the Simpsons over to Native American storytellers. So the last third of the movie is we've met, countless funny, great, humorous Native American writers and producers. So they've actually made a bunch of cartoons and segments that are going in the second half of the movie that will
Really?
tell it. So it's a Donick Cary joint, but it's also Donick Cary starting a joint. And then it's like, we hope a communal effort with a lot of our new friends.
Last question. When do you expect to put it out?
We hope to have something done within the next 3 to 6 months. And then, we were hoping to get it to Sundance, but that deadline is kind of now. And we're like, it's an interesting thing to make a movie when the subject matter is still morphing and changing. The conversation about, race and the football team not changing their name yet and this stuff. So and then we're doing animation, which just takes a little bit of time. So we want to finish the best version of this that we can. And we think it's 3 to 6 months or so. I also want to just give a shout out to our friend Jill and Steve Karp out there who came in to help finance this movie, are actually partners in this and executive producers on it. So another Nantucket connection.
Well, Donick, I'm delighted to be hearing about this. I can't wait to see it. And hopefully we'll be seeing it at the Dreamland before the end of 2022. I wish you the best.
Charlie, just before you go, I'll give you a quick sneak preview. Check this out.
All right.
So just because I'm working on it right now, I happen to have the movie. I happen to have the movie right here. This is the movie right now.
That's the whole movie.
That's the whole movie. So that's the process. Edit, cards everywhere, and eventually it'll be on in a theater near you soon.
Well, I'm not an expert on all this, but I know enough to know that it is a complicated business. What ends up at the end might have started off in the beginning, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
Well, again, I can't wait to see this. I know a lot of other people feel the same way. And I appreciate your taking the time to interrupt your schedule to do this. So thank you again.
Always a pleasure. Look forward to a nice night at the Dreamland conversation with you on some other film this summer. Looking forward to it.
Good. Me too. For Profiles, I'm Charley Walters on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. My guest has been Donick Cary. Thanks for joining us, and please tune in again.